I'm Sarah Grace McCandless, and this is OnBrand. You know, throughout the course of a lot of our conversations here, when we focus in on this desire for true connection between people and the companies that they engage with, there's been a real common denominator in all the conversations that we've had to date, and that has to do with listening. What does that mean, though? What does listening look like? You can say that you're listening to your consumer. There's qualitative and quantitative ways to do that. But listening is really only one step, right? It's what you do with what you hear. How do you take that data? What is data? How are the different ways to kind of come about it and come at it and add that so what and that now what to it? We're going to take a closer look at that particular topic today. And my guest is a real expert when it comes to customer strategy, listening, analytics, data, behavior, and the overall customer experience. Reggie Wideman is the Director of Strategy and Execution for Lytics. And he's going to talk to us a little bit today about his point of view on this really great subject of listening to your customer. Reggie, welcome to OnBrand.
Hi, Sarah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you here because honestly, you know, as I've been having different conversations with people from specific brands or subject matter experts who somehow are connected to this idea and this topic of engagement, how do you connect with your consumer authentically, looking for that personalization and an experience as well. Listening is really the common thread here. So let's first tell our listeners a little bit, have you tell a little bit about yourself, your background, and a little bit about Lytics as well.
Sure. So Reggie Wideman. I've been working in marketing, advertising, marketing technology for probably 15, 20 years now. Currently I'm with Lytics. Before that, I was with Salesforce. And before that, agency side, a couple different places. The focus for me professionally has always been about helping brands find organic ways to use technology to create those digital connections with consumers. That's when marketing works best, when it's seamless, when it feels like you're being talked to as an individual, not as a target demographic, if you will. So that's always been something I've gravitated toward. And building those experiences for customers at Salesforce was really rewarding. But when I had the opportunity to move to Lytics, it was like coming home, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The first is that Lytics is a CDP. We are designed as a smart hub of sort, which is sort of an intelligent hub of customer data, right? So many brands will have a data lake that will be filled with rich demographic data about their customers and their target customers. Once you build that thing, though, it becomes super difficult to make it actionable, particularly in real time. So CDPs became the answer to that question in a broad way. Lytics became a very specific answer to that question in that we provide the capability to pull that actionable data into marketing experiences that can be real time, but also a focus on machine learning coupled with with behavioral data in digital experiences that we believe are actually even more valuable to driving the experiences that we know consumers want. So in my role, at Lytics, I'm the Director of Strategy and Execution. It's sort of twofold. One, I'm sort of responsible for helping us define and refine the go-to-market for how we're going to serve our customers, and then also help those customers execute their marketing experiences and their MarTech ecosystem with the Lytics toolset. So that's me. That's what I do.
So in your world, the word customer is really referring to not just sort of the, I guess, end user, but the clients that you work with as well. Is that right?
Yeah, like everybody who has a thing has a customer, right?
Yeah.
So Lytics, I'm responsible for making sure our customers are being delighted by the tools that we bring to the table, and they're responsible for making sure that they're bringing marketing experiences to their customers that delight them as well.
Yeah, I love hearing about this too. This is an area I'm super passionate about, and it's an area we do a lot of work with, and my organization too, where we're looking at the different types of data and the different ways to kind of break down those experiences. You said the word actionable. You are singing my song because I think, you know, data is just like, those are some pretty charts and numbers, but if you don't add the so what and the now what to it, that's all it really is, right? So you mentioned behavioral data. Let's start there. Why don't you define that for us? What is behavioral data?
Sure. Uh, Probably many would define it differently. For me, behavioral data is data that is not demographic data, that is real time, that is derived directly from the consumers or customers' interaction with brand experience. So that's me scrolling through your website, looking at products, listening to podcasts. That's me in your app, selecting different experiences within the app. That's the digital tools you might use to track my interactions with a physical retail experience. All of that is behavioral data, and it's unique and differentiated from demographic data in that it is not assumptive data derived from things that we think we know about you, like your race, gender, place of origin, income.
Do you think that when you know demographic data, like historically, I think about that as something like maybe I am providing, right? I'm providing that information, which, you know, quite frankly, could or could not be accurate, right? And especially if you're thinking if you're getting that demographic data from social. Behavioral data, you're pulling from a lot of different touch points there. Is there more validity to that behavioral data? What makes behavioral data valuable?
Sure. So there's two questions there. So there's validity and then there's value. So what makes behavioral data valid is the point you made. Simply is that it is what the consumer customer is providing to you directly. Demographic data, you provide some of that data when you register with a brand so that you're receiving, you know, communications from them. You're providing demographic data. Other pieces of demographic data they are assuming or acquiring about you through other parties. So the demographic data is some data that you've provided and some data that they've learned about you and some assumptions that they've made about you. Not necessarily bad assumptions, but they are assumptions. So the behavioral data, what's valuable about it, and there's a component that makes it more valuable that I'll get to, is that it is that data that is provided from experience, right? You don't need to know these things about me or make assumptions about what I'm looking for to know that if I'm on your website and I'm scrolling through a particular product, I'm interested in that product. That is the ultimate way of understanding me as a consumer. But to make that valuable, it really requires the ability to execute in real time. So the thing about demographic data is it's very difficult to make real time. Behavioral data needs to be real time so that it can be actioned in the moment. So I'm on your website right now. I'm looking for a product right now. You can't take those actions or those things you've learned about me, throw them into a database, and then come back 3 months and see if I'm still interested. You need to surface the value and delight in real time while I'm there. So I believe behavioral data is more valuable because it is a true version of what this consumer is looking for, but it's also only achieves its real value if it can be executed upon in real time, if that makes sense.
It does. And it, you know, what it also kind of speaks to me, probably again, I make a lot of references to this, but my core is a writer and an empath. So I hear a story here. I hear a story with behavioral data versus maybe demographic, which you said is a lot of it is very assumptive. Behavioral seems to tell at least the beginning of a story or the idea of a story. You also mentioned that it's really important to kind of have the ability to pull the levers in real time and to act on it. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? And what are the benefits of doing so on really kind of, you know, being more reactive or maybe even proactive? Can you be proactive with behavioral data as well? Can you kind of get ahead of the curve from coming from that approach?
Yeah, and I think I would start with the limitations of demographic data. So if you think about demographic data, what you're creating when you create a demographic profile of a consumer is you are in fact creating a snapshot in time, right? You're creating a snapshot of who I am, what I look like, and what my interests were in the moment that those data points were acquired. And of course, with AI, machine learning, you can extrapolate that to the future. You know, I've worked with auto brands. You get somebody with into a mid-sized car. It's easy to extrapolate that one day down the road, you'll be able to get them into a luxury SKU. Sure, that makes sense. But I'm changing in real time, right? I'm changing at every moment. I'm also doing something that we have a very difficult time accounting for, which is I'm often shopping for different interests. So I might be shopping for someone else. Right? So you're going to have all these different signals that tell you different things. And if you try to place all that into a demographic profile, it's going to be really confusing. A thing that brands struggle with right now is what we call householding, which is understanding all the differentiated signals of consumers in one household, right? They might be using the same iPad. They might be clicking on the same ads on Hulu, right? These are different people. You don't know who they are. So now there's this exercise of figuring out, is this the mom? Is this the dad? Is this the child? Like, who should we be marketing to in this moment? And they're working through those things. They're making progress. But in reality, if we were focused only on behavioral, it wouldn't even matter. It wouldn't even matter if it's 3 people, because I'd be surfacing interest based upon those behaviors in real time. And that is really the best way to market to consumers.
Yeah, that's a great point. That makes a lot of sense too. I mean, it makes me, as you're talking, I'm thinking to, I mentioned, our company, we do a lot of work around this too, because if you think about, like, I'll just take the service part of a relationship, and somebody's made a phone call or sent out a tweet to get help for something. You can look at how long were you on the phone? How many interactions did you have to go back and forth? And that's one way to look at data. But the other kind of layer that we look at is the why behind it. Why did you call? Why did it take 10 minutes to solve? We really look at the why behind that so we can improve that experience moving forward, should it be something that repeats itself. When you think about behavioral data and consumers, how would you kind of describe what types of consumers are out there kind of as a first step as you start to approach behavioral data? Do they fall into buckets of sorts? And if so, how would you define that?
Types of consumers. Well, I think it's interesting. From a demographic perspective, it's a lot more straightforward. The buckets are the volumes of data that you know about consumers, right? So here's the bucket of consumers for whom I have just an email address, right? They've opted into my newsletter. And then here are the bucket of consumers that I have purchase history for, right? So they've purchased with our brand. They seem to have some affinity for our brand, and they're ripe for repurchase. And then here are the buckets of consumers who are using our apps, and we have richer data about them, and they've opted into other experiences, and we're now building a full 360 profile of them. From a behavioral perspective, I would say that there aren't really buckets of consumers. There's more like buckets of opportunity, right? So if we're thinking about what we're going to do with behavioral data, we're using the signals from their behavior to define the real-time opportunity that we should be exposing to them, right? Like one conversation we had at the beginning of last year was with brands who were trying to figure out what to do with COVID sensitivity, right? Should I be sending you emails about discounts when you're worried about your life, right? Should I be sending you emails saying, hey, are you okay? We as a brand care about you, when you're not really affected, you're not worried about this virus, right? And so we talked about being able to use their digital properties, where most big brands had statements about COVID on their websites, right? To see if consumers were looking at that data, if they were paying attention to those digital touch points on your site, well, then those would be the customers that you would probably put into that bucket of COVID sensitivity, that they would have more affinity for the brand if we addressed the current affairs of the world in our marketing toward them. Whereas other consumers who just aren't paying attention to those things, aren't touching those things, don't seem to have any affinity, let's just treat them like normal. Let's tell them things are on sale. Let's tell them when it's 2 for 1, and that's the world they want to live in. And I think those buckets will change in real time. Like one day I may be very sensitive to what's going on in the world. The next day I may not be. Right? One day I'm a purchaser, I just want to buy my thing. The next day I'm like looking at things, but I'm worried about, should I be spending this money because I might lose my job, right? I'm a different person every 5 minutes. And behavioral data allows you to acknowledge that fact in your marketing.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously the impact of the pandemic for the last year. I was thinking about that a lot, because when you think about the topic of behaviors, talk about something that is really impacting behaviors. And I love what you said too. There were a lot of brands and companies that sort of reacted and rushed to the table, or didn't react. I spent a lot of time at the beginning of the pandemic doing some consulting on crisis management, telling people to pause, like, do not send out these emails or promotions. It sounds very tone deaf.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so you have to think about the change of behavior. So think about this last year and how our behaviors have changed. Some of it will be everlasting, right? And some of it will go back to maybe not the old way or a different way, but a more familiar way.
Yeah.
What do you think will kind of stay? What's temporary that maybe we can learn from? I mean, what are your thoughts on how this has impacted our behaviors in the last 12 months or so?
I think the difference with purpose-driven marketing is that it is a real commitment. Like, this isn't like new Coke versus old Coke. Like, oh, it's not working, we'll go back to the old thing. If you make a commitment, you know, there are brands who last year made a commitment to equity, to Black Lives Matter, to diversity, and all of these commitments that they've made, they aren't things that they can just leave out there as sort of a branding or marketing exercise and then move on to the next thing. Consumers, particularly millennials, will be responsive to that. And if they feel that the brand has betrayed these ideals that they expressed during a time of crisis, it will affect their relationships with those consumers. So I think it's going to be really interesting that we're not going to be able as brands to make sort of slapdash decisions like, oh, this thing's happening and people are upset about it, so let's release a statement. It's going to have to be, if we're going to do this, what's next and how to just become part of our brand and how we market. Which also means, to bring it all back together, that it requires an acute understanding of who your customers are to know that whether this is a thing you should even be doing. I mean, I think there are brands who looked at everything that happened last year and said, what we do is irrelevant to what's going on in the world, and it'll be disingenuous of us to take stand here, right? And there are other brands who stood up and said, you know, we're affected by this, our employees are affected by this, and we want the world to know that we want to make a difference here. And that just can't end when people feel better about things, right? It has to be sort of a lifelong commitment for a brand, if such a thing can exist.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think that's something when we think about behaviors that will change too. There were brands that were directly impacted. There were brands that had to pivot in order to survive. There were brands that actually weren't really impacted one way or the other. I was actually thinking about, like, if I think about behaviors that have changed, one thing that really comes to mind for me is fitness or movement or exercise. You know, I mean, I was somebody who spent 8 hours a week in my dance studio. Well, it wasn't my dance studio, I wish, but the dance studio I go to, you know, I was in yoga. I was in a local spin studio as well. And speaking of that, I mean, you look at something like Peloton, right? That just skyrocketed. I was just listening to, and you know what's happening with them too. What's so interesting is not only did they kind of thrive and rise during all of this even more, but they innovated. You know, now they are getting into sort of the music area, doing exclusive deals with Beyonce. And I just heard this morning about, you know, having original tracks or cuts that are going to be sort of a music source. So it's just really interesting to kind of hear about these innovations. Is there a brand that comes to mind for you? Not necessarily anybody that you work with, but just maybe from a consumer standpoint that you think is using behavioral data really well?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few. So I think I love the Peloton example because it is actually a great example of how you're taking demographic data and real-time behavioral data, right, from this fitness experience and combining it to create these unique experiences for consumers. And what I love about what they're doing is they're doing something very similar to what we've seen for one of the brands I'd talk about, which is Netflix, right? They're paying attention to the real-time behaviors of consumers using their tools, and they're responsive to that. Like it's well documented that pretty much all of their platform development or all their content development is just based on algorithm, right? What people are looking at, what people are talking about, what people are interested in. They go and make those shows, or they go and acquire those shows from other places. So they're a great example. One that I think has really just kind of nailed it, frankly, though, has been Uber. You know, we can malign Uber in some ways, but really what Uber has done well is understand consumer behavior. They understand where I go, how frequently I go there. One thing that I've noticed recently is that, like, if you're platinum, they'll offer you a discount for your most traveled route. So just being able to do that programmatically on a customer by customer basis is really unique. And then when they moved years ago into Uber Eats, into the food delivery business, like, that's a profile, right? That's where you're taking a few bits of demographic data, which are mostly just location based, and coupling it with rich real-time data about what my food preferences are, what times of day I eat, when I travel, why I travel, how frequently I travel, and really just serving it up. if I go on vacation and I'm not traveling, Uber will send me a note saying, hey, what's going on? Usually you're going to this place. You want a 10% off? You want $5 off? What do you need? And then same for food. They're offering up, here are the place you usually order from right now. There's no delivery fee. That's how you keep customers engaged. And I'm only getting information about things that I'm interested in, places I go, things I eat. So I think they've really done a fantastic job of targeting their customer base behaviorally in a way that is inoffensive and also brings them closer to the individual consumer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've had some experiences with Uber since the onset of COVID, and I was like, what's this going to be like, and they're over communicative in a great way about protocol, safety, right? And you're right. They had that Uber Eats vision before this all began. And of course, that's another area where we saw things just skyrocket. Everything had to become kind of contactless or online. I mentioned, my dance studio and yoga and spin. Everybody, some of the organizations were already online. Some were not and had to pivot very quickly. They weren't a virtual experience, but you're right. With Uber, there is, it's interesting because it's been impacted. You're not necessarily Ubering as freely as you would before, but they've really they've responded to, I guess, the behaviors that we've had to adopt as a nation, as a world, right? And in terms of just these safety protocols is a kind of a first place to think about that.
You remind you. I hate to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but you also remind me of it's another great example of a purpose-driven commitment, because one of the things that they did that I was very impressed by was during the shutdowns that most of the country experienced. They were running ads. Don't ride Uber. Like, don't use our, where our people are delivering food, but don't ride Uber. And I remember pulling the app up and getting a message saying, please only take this trip if you have to. Yeah. And to put a message out there like that is going to negatively impact your revenue is powerful, and that's definitely purpose driven.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. I love the Netflix example too, because that's another great example of something that, gosh, remember when Netflix used to send you actual physical DVDs? That wasn't that long ago.
I'm too young for that. I'm too young for that. I don't know what you're talking about.
20, right?
Ask my mom.
Child. I hear this from the yesteryears. Yes. But okay, it wasn't that long ago,
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about my 3 teenage nieces who don't know that you can actually hold a phone up to your ear. You just use it like this. But Netflix, wow, that was a brand that could have died by what, kind of gone by way of the Blockbusters of the world, if you will. And it didn't. And then now you're right. That is something you mentioned in the beginning, being able to leverage in real time as much as possible. For something like a Netflix, they can do that. I mean, they probably don't know that things like, there are certain shows like Queen's Gambit. Did they know that was going to be such a hit? And they can pivot and start to put things and fast track things into production that are more in that realm. Peloton, obviously, that's a little bit of a longer runway, but I think they've been pretty quick to that too. That got me thinking about sort of marketing in general and advertising and how things have changed a lot in that world. A lot of the conversations I've had, if we hone in on social, they're still needing to remind brands that this is a two-way conversation, right? It's not just talking out or talking at, but, if you kind of go back to, years and years ago in marketing and advertising, I think about the days of Mad Men, right? And kind of that era. Mm-hmm. What do you think are the most significant changes from how the approaches were taken back in, in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years? How has that changed in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years with this emphasis on behavioral data from a marketing and advertising standpoint?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think the most amazing thing about that is really the approach that we saw portrayed in Mad Men really has only begun to change in the last 2, 3, 4 years. Because when you think about the Mad Men approach, the whole premise was predicated on the force of personality, right? This man having just the ability to just pinpoint emotional triggers that would cause people to want to purchase products and to be able to deliver that. Now, the problem with that approach, and it's the approach that we took until very recently, is that it was all perspective based, right? Don Draper may have been really good at figuring out what the emotional core message was to tell a story, but it was for like a white man. And pretty much just a white man, and that's it. And it was fine because they were the only ones who really had purchasing power back then.
Right.
And while the way we may have exchanged is, or changed, not exchanged, is that we have the white man and then we added the white woman and we added the black man and the black woman and then Hispanic man and Hispanic woman. We didn't just say, well, these are people who have interests and needs that we should be responsive to. So that is how behavioral has really changed the game. And I think that, there's two components to it. There is, there's sort of the ethics of marketing. And should we be marketing to people based upon historic attributes that we used to bias against them? And then there is efficiency. I mean, I think it's just far more efficient to be focused on behavioral attributes in real time to activate consumers. Like it's a faster way to get the job done. It's a cleaner way to get the job done. It doesn't require the types of complex segmentation that we're used to having to execute in order to build scalable marketing programs. So I think there's both of those sides to it, and I think we're only seeing it change in the past few years because just the weight of trying to market to every new type of consumer that we can imagine has become too much for the marketing machine. And so we need a better way. And I think artificial intelligence machine learning allowed us to scale a little bit more, but making the commitment to behavioral is, I think, the thing that makes that scale really take off.
I'm thinking about the whole Don Draper philosophy. Don't get me wrong, I love men and Don Draper, but boy, he told a story, right? He told a story, he sold it, but he didn't tell your story. He told your story. And he was good at it. He was really good at it, but he told the story it was sort of a story like, you need to be this or buy into this. And then you're talking about behavioral data. This is kind of a great way to kind of wrap things up here in our conversation. Is I'm hearing that helps us tell a more personalized story. If we think again about the way we're communicating, connecting with a consumer, the offers that we're sending to them, the support that we're giving them, is that accurate? And how, how do you see, what would be your advice to a brand who's looking to lean into having more authentic, personalized engagements and connections?
I mean, the advice is simple, and it's funny. It'll remind me of a story that I had with my boss a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking about a brand and we were talking about the things that were keeping them from being able to execute real-time personalized experiences. And I had kind of come to the conclusion that, well, because of these structures in their business and their marketing organization, that's what was holding them back, right? That they were going to need to reorganize how their marketing organization was actually structured, its relationship to their technology organization, where they managed and kept their data. Like all of those things were going to have to be reorganized if they really wanted to commit and execute real-time personalized experiences. And he looked at me and he said, well, yeah, but brands do that all the time. Do it all the time. They reorg, they move things around, change the names of departments. He's like, if that's what's holding them back, then nothing's holding them back. The only thing holding them back is the will to do it. And I thought that was really interesting because he's absolutely right. If you had a mid-sized company or a small mom and pop and somebody said, you got to start using real-time personalized data to grow your business, they would be like, Instagram's about as far as I'm going to get, thank you, right? But if you're a multinational corporation, multi-billion-dollar corporation, there really is nothing holding you back from today starting to rebuild how you market and engage with your consumers in real time using behavioral data. You can afford the technology expenses. You have the intelligence within your organization to execute it. So really, it's just the will. It's just the will to want to engage with your consumers that way, to want to let go of an old world style of thinking that says we have these buckets of people and we put the things in the buckets that align with those people. Instead, you live in a world where we have products and people want things, and we're going to give them the things that they say they want. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, yes, you have more advantages as a larger company, but, Instagram's not a bad place to start too. I don't know. I feel like everything I get served up on there, I'm like, I do want that. I do need that. Thank you very much. And I don't mind I love that, because if they're targeting me with ads based on my behavior and it's something that makes me head nod, basically, it doesn't feel intrusive to me. It actually feels helpful or beneficial. It does feel more personalized. And I think, that's what we're striving for, right? We have products, we are businesses, we are selling things, but it is about the experience, not the product itself or the price, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. On Instagram, I would say 30 mid-size to boutique brands target me for fashion every single day. Right. But I don't ever hear from large brands, right? They don't know who I am or where I am or what I'm interested in, because they don't know what channel to find me in. And you've got these small brands that are competing with the micro brands, right? That are just killing it. I mean, they're just killing it. And sometimes they get big enough to get acquired by one of those big companies. And then they kind of lose their magic. But yeah, no, I think social is really the way you do it when you're small. But if you're big already, you have limitless opportunity.
Right. And social just being one of them, and we could have a whole follow-up talk about that, I'm sure. Reggie, I so appreciate your time and insights. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart and something we, very core to our organization too. And it's just a favorite topic of mine. So really got me thinking about behavioral data and how important that is and analytics. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. It's fun.